Good evening. So we're going to get started, and thank you for coming tonight. We're trying to make sure that everybody gets a chance to. I think what we're going to do with the crowd size we have now, we can go ahead and open up for questions throughout the presentation. So first and foremost, again, it's Parks Director with Broward County Parks and Recreation, and as many residents and visitors to this part of Broward County know, especially people who live around Hollywood North Beach, there are several segments of State Road A1A that has seen some very significant sunny day flooding issues. And it's been going on for quite some time with tidal water backs up into the road, like we saw during the recent king tides, which is something that we see reoccurring year after year. As part of Hollywood North Beach Park, the Broward County Parks and Recreation Division operates, as you know, 5 pocket parks, as well as Hollywood North Beach on the other side of the Intracoastal on A1A. And of course, it's about a 1-mile stretch along Sheridan Road, north of Sheridan Road, I should say. The Hollywood North Beach Park Tidal Flood Resiliency Mitigation Project that we were discussing tonight is a proposal to mitigate flooding by adding tidal barriers within the park properties along the east bank of the Intracoastal Waterway, and simultaneously improve opportunities for passive recreation while increasing the amount of coastal habitat and environmental resources. It's going to be a beautiful project. Sure that knows that we want to get everyone's input on how we go about this project. Very important for us. We've been very, very fortunate also. The design of this project has been funded by the state grant from the Florida Department of Environmental Protection. And as part of the process, our design team that is here tonight to present the conceptual plans and to participate in the conversation with residents and park users who would like to provide input. This here tonight consists of our staff, and I'll introduce them just briefly. Martin Gross and Linda Briggs. Martin Gross is our from our Parks Planning Design team. He has been very, very good at many projects. Anything close to water, he's been involved in projects from the sawgrass to the seagrass on a number of occasions. One of the last projects was our Everglades Holiday Park project, which was a $20 million project that if you get a chance to go out and see it, it was a remarkable project. I can't say enough for what he did working with federal, state, and local agencies to make that happen. So if you ever get a chance, but he's also been involved in many over-the-water projects from boulder improvement program funding, as well as just parks along the Intracoastal, as well as inland. So that's very important. Linda Briggs is our environmental management administrator. She runs a crew of various scientists, botanists, wildlife biologists that are very involved in projects, including our 20 natural area and preserve sites around the county, some of the most pristine natural areas in South Florida, Florida, and nationwide. They are really outstanding sites. She's very involved in this project as well. We've been very blessed to also have engineering consultants with Chin Moore and Associates, Cummins, Cedarburg, Coastal, and Marine Engineering, and Brizaga. So I want to turn it over, and again, we're going to keep it open conversation. We've got, I think, a smaller group. We'll have a mic passed around. I want to turn it over to Brent Whitfield, PE and environmental scientist at CMA.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it. I'll also mention what a pleasure it is to work with Martin. He certainly knows parks and coastal environment, and working with Linda as well. It's been a pleasure to work with the staff. So as Mr. West had pointed out, my name is Brent Whitfield. I'm with Chenmore & Associates. So I'm a consultant that was hired by the county to work on this project. And to this point, we've kind of done a conceptual design. Before we go into detailed design, we want to show you what we've done, get feedback from the community and stakeholders. The team consists of myself with Chenmore and some of my colleagues who are with me, who are from engineering and landscape architecture backgrounds. We also have Cummins Cedarburg folks here who are really specialized in coastal engineering. and the environmental resources elements, as we'll talk a little bit about. It's really, really critical in a coastal environment. And then Erica and Tanoa here with Brazaga do a lot of public outreach and specialize in kind of climate related issues and resilience. And so it's a good fit for the project. But I'll go ahead and jump in. And as was mentioned, we have a second microphone. So if you have a question, and obviously I could talk loud enough for everyone to hear, but there are a few people that have called into the Zoom. And so the microphone is so that if you ask a question, folks can hear it on the microphone. So jump on in. Overall, we're going to talk about the project. We're going to talk about kind of the existing conditions that are out there, the proposed improvements that we're looking at, and then kind of go over some related projects and kind of summarize. So about the project, we're basically focused on a segment that's roughly 1 long north of Sheridan along A1A. And those of you, I'm sure that you're here, you're familiar with, there's a series of kind of pocket parks along the west side of A1A managed by the county: Loggerhead, Leatherback, Green, Kemps Ridley, and Hawksbill. And as was mentioned earlier, there's a lot of flooding that often happens on a sunny day because tides from the intercoastal end up kind of overcoming the current coastal embankment there and coming up through the drain and flooding A1A. And so the intention of this project is to raise a continuous tidal barrier within the parks that prevent that type of flooding from occurring in the future. And I always think this is wonderful to know and happy to share that the design services, the permitting that's being done is funded by a grant from the DEP. So Broward County procured this money from the state, and that's what's being used for this effort. So existing conditions, these are pictures from just September of this year. Those of you who may have been along A1A will notice in the top left corner, that's just north of our project limits. There's some kind of marine industries, commercial use right there. And just north of Hawksbill Park, significant flooding during the king tide. On the lower left, this is right next to Loggerhead Park. That's the intersection with Sheridan. You can see how much flooding is occurring at that location, and then some pictures from in the parks, which are flooded as well. So how's this happening? What are the numbers? Cummins Cedarburg, as I mentioned, does a lot of great coastal engineering analysis. And so they kind of did some data crunching on tide data from the south gauge at Port Everglades, the tide gauge there, and determined that there's 22 days over the past 6 years where the tides exceeded 2.2 NAVD. Well, as you can see in that highlight, there are low points along the sidewalk, basically, especially up in that Hawksbill Park area where the west side of A1A is at 2. So right there, the tide is higher than the sidewalk. So of course, you're seeing flooding. When we look at what the sea level rise projections are, there's like the International Panel of Climate Change, various different organizations, NOAA, put out publications of what's the sea level rise projection. Cummins Cedarburg sorts through all that data, looks at what it would be here, and the prediction is that an intermediate high tide or a king tide for 2070, so we're trying to be resilient looking 50 years into the future, is a 4.6. That's obviously a concern. So we want to make sure that we're thinking about what prevents the flooding today and what will mitigate the flooding in the future. And I'll talk a little bit about that 4.6 number and how it actually kind of works into the planning that the county and the city of Hollywood have been doing. And you'll kind of see how these pieces stitch together. But before we get into that, I wanted to talk about some of the analysis we did for the flooding. So we did something that's called inundation modeling. So it's a computer simulation. I say we, Cummins Cedarburg, did a lot of inundation modeling, some very cool, sophisticated modeling with Mike software, which is a DHI Danish product, and basically created a surface of the land surface, a surface of the bathymetry using data from NOAA and the Army Corps of Engineers, and then simulated what do these tides do on the surface. And it's going to be kind of hard to see, but on the right, when I click here, you'll see what the simulation does. So it should start filling in. You can see the blues and greens and yellows and reds. That's the king tide cycle, getting on the worst case 2070 in the future. You basically have flooding the full extent, and at the peak of that king tide cycle, as much as 2 feet of flooding, which aligns with what we projected for that 2070 high tide. So that's not just 2 feet of flooding up by Hawksbill, that's 2 feet of flooding the whole way down the corridor in 2070. So these are the tools that we're using when we're looking at how does our results kind of project when we look at what types of improvements we're proposing. So here's the inundation modeling. This is just a static image of the peak. So the current king tide, if you can see, there's flooding here at the Sheridan intersection, and then there's flooding at the northern end. This is exactly what we saw September of this year. The flooding is really at the north and south ends and then in the park. What's projected for 2050 is that flooding is deeper and encroaching farther towards the middle, and then 2070, it's the full extent. So that's what the model predicts, which aligns with what we saw, at least for present day. So what is it that we're trying to do? We're trying to look at how we can make some kind of a bulkhead or some improvement that creates a tidal barrier, but we're also looking at what are the pieces of the puzzle. We can't just build that without looking at what other things are in the parks and in the area. So we have environmental and marine resources that we'll discuss a little bit that we've done some investigations and we'll need to work with. There's kind of the condition of the existing park and the structure there, and then regulatory considerations. So on the environmental concerns, the Cummins-Cedarburg team has divers and environmental scientists that went in the field and did detailed surveys of the seagrasses that are present in the water, in the benthos there, coral that are currently attached to some of the rocks and various structures that's outside along the whole corridor, and then mangroves that you see that are along that coastal shoreline. And these are ones I bring to attention, not just because they're species that are important species for the environment and the coastal resources, but they're also species that are we need to pay attention to from a regulatory perspective. So when we go to construction, these are species we need to either protect in place or mitigate if we're impacting. So as we're kind of mapping all this out, we're trying to make sure that whatever we're doing with our improvement has the least amount of impact on these resources, and the impacts we have, we can mitigate. And that'll be part of the permitting process with various entities, the state, the feds, and all those folks. Now, structurally, I don't know how many of you have kind of been in the parks recently, but there are places where there's some erosion concerns, where some of the shorelines in the upper right picture, there's some like sand, cement bags that were used for the embankment. Those are kind of sloughing off a little bit. There's some places where the undermining of the asphalt walkway is such that there's some potholes developing, and there's spots under a concrete sidewalk where there's not as much support there. There's nothing that's, I would say, inherently dangerous, but it's signals that there's concern. It's obviously not a condition that's going to be something that can be kept long term. So the last thing I want to talk about, and bringing back the 4.6 that we mentioned on that 2070 king tide projection. So Broward County has been very forward thinking with respect to planning for this scenario. So in 2020, the county commission adopted an article in their planning documents, Resiliency Standards for Tidal Flood Protection. I've excerpted it. You need to get up to a minimum elevation of 5 feet. And so if you're by 2050, everybody needs to be there. But if it's an interim period and you're doing a major reconstruction or a project on that property, then that's what you need to do as well. I'm not sure why this little bubble's here, but I think it should, yeah, there we go. So that was also what's called like a model language in that county ordinance. And it was called a model language because each of the municipalities in Broward County also needed to adopt it in some form or fashion. So the city of Hollywood, which would apply in this case, in their code of ordinances in section 150 has a large section describing some of the different ways that the work could, the bulkheads would be phased in and the requirements would be phased in. But again, at the end of the day, you see tidal barriers shall have a minimum elevation of 5 feet. So we kind of know where our target needs to be. We know that the projections show 4.6 feet in 2070, 50 years out. We know that the ordinances from the county and the city say 5 feet. So we need to bring up a barrier between the Intracoastal and A1A that gets to 5 feet. So that's what we're proposing. So the crest elevation of this barrier will be 5 feet. Wherever possible, which has worked out to be pretty much the full length, we're going to use like a limestone rock riprap embankment. And then they'll have like a earthen berm kind of edge in order to prevent stuff like you see with that sand cement bag. There'll be a filter fabric, there'll be a bedding stone, there'll be a lot of requirements for how it's all placed and stabilized. And behind it, there's going to be a kind of shallow, kind of like a seawall you'd see, but not necessarily steel, like a plastic or some kind of non-metallic barrier that is not for structural purposes, but to prevent seepage. So if you've got a high tide, sometimes that water will seep through your earthen berm and start to kind of bubble up on the backside. We don't want that. So when we talk some of the proposed improvements, you'll see there's a barrier to prevent seepage. And the idea is we'll have a consistent waterward edge at 5 foot elevation. We're also proposing to create some new habitat. So there's areas that are currently upland in the park that we're going to kind of convert into mangrove habitat. And then we're proposing to still keep them as recreational passive use park spaces, but to kind of emphasize the linear connectivity nature. So in between the 5 pocket parks, we're going to make sure that our barrier that we raise up to 5 feet has a kind of a upland side connectivity. So right now, between a lot of the
but if you wanted to ride a bike, rollerblade, whatever, this will be a nice continuous run, and it will be part of that high elevation rate.
In Loggerhead Park, I'm sorry about this little bubble here, but the changes are really, there's a barrier with the rock riprap along the water line here. And then there'll be kind of a seawall behind that. Like I mentioned, the barrier to prevent seepage that'll be behind in the parking lot behind the guardrail that's out there now. On the northern side, that area will kind of come up into an earthen berm, and we'll have some new plantings and a 10-foot wide multi-use path that will connect going north. On the south side of the park, there is an area that is particularly low. And what we've learned from looking at the inundation modeling, actually water doesn't come necessarily this way to Sheridan. It comes straight through here, right into the intersection. So up to 5 feet, it's a rise of like 18 inches or something. And then back down. So as you come through the parking lot, it'll kind of pick up and pick back down. And then that kind of berm or widened ridge will come through and tie in to the gravity wall on the side of the Sheridan kind of on-ramp for the bridge. So we'll create this barrier here at 5, and that will prevent future flooding at Sheridan Street. Moving on to Leatherback Park and Green Park. So the Leatherback Park will basically raise the elevation at the water line and then blend that elevation back into the natural grade of the park. On the Green Park side, we're actually gonna, if you know the area, there's kind of an area that's like a little bit of a sandy beach here. So we're gonna expand that and dig a portion of the upland area out and create a larger mangrove planter space. So the riprap on the water side here is going to be a wave break. There's a lot of pretty high-speed boat traffic here. It's not a no wake zone, so you see some pretty notable waves that might be an issue for our mangrove planter. So we'll have a riprap wave break and then the mangrove planter there. A pretty good size area of mangroves. And then we're going to try to emphasize the path to have opportunities to kind of see the mangroves and still a spot where you can kind of look out and see the water. Going north, as you note, maybe there's some breaks in the connectivity. There's private landowners and residences there, so we only pick up at those edges, but we pick up from the 5-foot sidewalk, expand to a 10-foot wide path, and then run along the upland side here, trying to minimize impacts to the existing mangroves as much as possible. So we're gonna kind of build up from the edge of the back of the mangrove up to 5 with the barrier and rock riprap, and then we'll have an elevated walking path, multi-use path at elevation 5, and then grade back down into a swale so we can still capture water that's coming off of the edge of pavement on A1A. And then again at Kemp's Ridley, opening up some more mangrove area. There will be, in order to blend this, the top of the boardwalk is not at elevation 5. So we're going to need to transition the first, I don't know, 60 feet or so of the boardwalk. We'll have to rebuild to bring it up to that elevation 5. So we're basically raising where the boardwalk ties in. But the bulk of the boardwalk will not be part of the we've got the riprap on the edge and bringing up the elevation of the border to 5, but along portion. Marine area on the northern edge, and this portion of the sidewalk is the lowest stretch, and it has the narrowest area. So what we're going to propose is doing the similar style where we have the rock riprap to a cap on our impervious barrier or impermeable barrier, but we're going to have basically what amounts to like a 2.5-foot tall wall on the back of the sidewalk. So when you're walking down that section of the sidewalk, there'll be a wall that kind of goes from 0, tapers up about 2.5 feet, and then tapers back down to make sure that we can get that elevation 5 in there. And at that point, really right here where the shore comes the closest to the sidewalk, we'll just have like a little planter space. So maybe some beach sunflower or some kind of native plant that we can tuck in there that won't need irrigation or anything like that, and will be a nice kind of attractive amenity on the top of a short wall that's on the backside of the sidewalk. There is going to be some impacts to the existing mangroves there because there's just not much room to do anything else. And so the mangroves that need to be removed in that area will work through mitigation planning and hopefully be seen well with the state and federal folks, considering we're planting mangroves as well and kind of doing our best to protect the marine resources. So those are the kind of big picture improvements. And I want to talk about how the benefits. So we created this whole computer model to see what does it look like now. Let's see what happens when we build our project. So if you look here, this is from some of the detailed plans. You can see the mangrove is the green, the blue is the seagrass line, and here's some red contour lines of how we're doing our grading plan. We cut all that off, of course, where we come up to an adjacent private property. So in your inundation model, we have these dots are along the places where we're putting in our elevation 5 barrier. The gaps, the elevation is what it is. In a lot of these cases, like these private properties, I think their seawalls are like 4.5 or something, or 4. So it's not going to be a problem for a long time. Some of the most northern areas, not so much. So we wanted to show what it looks like if we build the proposed. So if you remember the current condition, and as we modeled it, there's a lot of flooding in the north and the south of A1A. Current condition 2024, after we've built our project, the north and the south are not flooding anymore because we've cut off that opportunity for the tide water to creep into A1A. 2050, 3.3, there's flooding in A1A. And that's because the pockets in between our project, which are privately owned properties, there's water coming in and around. So the concern is, well, what about those properties? If you remember, the ordinances are such that as those folks make changes, I mean, I don't know what'll happen there, but I have seen very few multi-million-dollar waterfront homes that don't do major projects on from time to time. At some point, it's likely that those seawalls will be part of the, building department's purview, and they'll come up to match. So we ran a simulation where we said, okay, let's go ahead and bring everything to 5 just to make sure we understand what that would look like. So this would assume that the city and county ordinances have been such that folks where tidal water is trespassing into the public right-of-way around our tidal barrier, or their existing seawalls in disrepair, or they're doing an improvement on their property that exceeds 50% of the cost of their seawall, it kicks in and they need to bring their seawall up to 5. That's what this simulation would be. And here you go. The flooding along A1A and the whole corridor is mitigated. So the county here is looking to say, hey, let's do our part. We have a large section of this corridor where we can include that tidal barrier and break that opportunity for water to get into A1A. And then and as I showed in the current condition, that'll be a major improvement. The projected future sea level rise, there'll eventually be points where, in order to prevent the flooding from recurring, it'll require other private property owners to do their part. One of the other things I wanted to, this is just I did include some examples. So the current condition, existing condition, proposed condition, all seawalls, you can see at the current 2024, you got that flooding in the north and the south portion of our project limits in existing, but when we build our project and when everybody does their seawall, no flooding. And then the 2070 case, right now it's not good at all. In 2070, if you didn't improve the bulkheads or the tidal barrier, if we do just our park improvements, you can see it drops from 2 feet deep to 8 inches deep, but it's still the whole run. But once everybody comes along and does their seawalls, then it'll be cleaned up. So I wanted to put a slide in here. You could see all of them next to each other. The last thing there's 2 more things I wanted to mention, the schedule. So we have been working this year, working with Martin and Linda on the conceptual design, which is what you see. These are pictures basically from the slide. If you want to see at the easels here, there's the existing aerial, our proposed concept, and then those cross sections I had talked about for each of the segments. That's what we've been working up until this point and trying to share that information with the public. Next year, we basically have an 18-month window where we're going to take these concepts and your input and create a set of detailed design drawings that can be advertised for a contractor to bid on and construct. That part is not easy, but will be the easy part. The tough part will be getting all the state and federal permits. And really, it's just making sure we get the conversation started early enough that the Army Corps can get through all the processes they need for mitigation on things like coral and various other seagrass and some of the elements that we're looking at. So thankfully, we got some good partners on our team that know that process well. So the hope then is that we get our permits by 2026 and go out for construction after that. I just kind of have a wide window on here because I don't really know. We're very early in the process, but that's kind of the general timeline. What I also wanted to mention is there will be some construction, I think, before we break ground, which is from the DOT. And they shared some information with me, and some of this is some permit documents. So they are looking at doing a seawall on a portion of on the west side of A1A south of Sheridan, outside of our project. I thought it would be good for me to kind of share with you guys. They're also looking at doing a pump station between Franklin and Perry and a pump station south of Sheridan. And then there's also, that's on the kind of drainage side because they know they have flooding issues, of course. And then they also have a plan they're working on now that from what I could tell in the plans is really about adding some dedicated bike lanes and making it better for multimodal use. So these are some plans that are hard to read, but you can kind of see this is their Sheridan pump station project. So they're collecting water just from the road. This isn't about tidal conditions. This is about collecting rainfall and addressing some of the drainage issues. And right here, they're looking at a pump station. Along here, they're looking at a seawall. So if you look a little closer, here's the seawall they're proposing. Kind of this construction underway. This is not related to the county parks project. This is a DOT state project. And then similarly, up on the kind of north end of our project and beyond. So here's Hawksbill, and then some of these northern streets that had drainage issues. There's a pump station they're proposing up here between Franklin and Perry that's kind of the northern edge. And as we saw in those pictures, it's a low spot. So naturally you're going to have some drainage issues. This is the pump station they're proposing kind of on the west side, kind of right at the corner at the top of the end of Hawksbill's path where the boardwalk comes in. So they're looking at a pump station and then an outfall. So that kind of covers all the things that I was going to talk about. I didn't see any hands while I was talking, but I'd be happy to take questions now. Sure. And we have a microphone so the folks watching at home can.
Hi, my name is Bob. The one thing I didn't hear you talk about is along the intercoastal there, I'm sure that FDOT has flap gates or check valves. You didn't mention that. Without fixing those, you're not going to stop the flooding. So what are the plans for those? Because we have the same problem south Sheridan Street all along A1A where they just won't fix the flap gates. So the flooding just goes on and on and on. Thank you.
Yeah, excellent point. And we'll get to other questions in a minute, but that is definitely going to be part of our plan. There's a couple different versions. I know a city of Fort Lauderdale uses these WayPro devices that are inserted into the end of the pipe on the outfall side, or you can even put it on the upstream side at the inlet that is like a kind of a rubber valve, check valve of sorts. And then there's flap gates. And so we'll be looking at the different products, but we have to do, I think there's 5 locations in our overall corridor where there are outfall pipes from A1A where we're going to have to do some kind of flap gates. And we have been in conversations with the DOT staff, knowing that we're going to have to work together on that. But excellent point. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Joshua Baymel, and I'm actually the engineer of record for that project that's under design right now
Thank you.
for the FDOT.
Wonderful. I think we've probably been on emails together.
Yeah, so I just wanted to follow up with your question. We are on our project installing at those outfalls. I think 6 locations,
6.
New backflow preventers with a drainage structure in front of each one.
Okay.
So we are actually going to be helping to address that issue and combined with the pump station project and the seawall project that you're doing.
Wonderful.
Mhm.
That was a terrific question. Thank you.
Thank you so much. My name is Carol Shuham. I'm the Hollywood Commissioner for this
Wonderful.
district and really cannot thank the county enough for taking this project on. We think it's such a valuable use of this space. My question really is, what can we do to expedite it? If we get the permitting in 25, 26, what can we do as residents, as the city of Hollywood? What can we do to help?
Or we've done a lot of due diligence with respect to identifying utilities and coordinating with FPL. We've been on the phone with all the different agencies and entities we need to. But I would imagine there might come points when we're trying to push through some of those permits where maybe a letter of, agreement or, some kind of additional other stakeholders are interested in may help. And I'll definitely be working with the county staff. I've heard that, yeah. I'm sure, yeah. That would be very helpful. And I think it can go a long way with these folks who are well-intentioned, but often kind of slow, or it's a laborious thing to get through some of the steps with them. I think there's also going to be points along the way in the construction side where we're going to need to develop grant funding sources. So we'll be working with the county staff about that. We've got the grant dollars to take us through design and permitting. The construction side, there were some arrangements with the state, but there's other things that have to get worked out. So I'm sure a willing partner, an elected such as yourself, would be very helpful.
My name is Fred Furs, and I'm sorry, a little bit late, so I may have missed something, but
No.
I walked in when you were talking about the residences that some of these improvements are gonna, are butting up against.
Mhm.
But so what is, like, you're building this, and did I understand correctly that you're gonna hope that in the future, these houses that somebody requires them to either build, seal the wall, or
So excellent question. So we are doing what we can to basically bring all of the county's parks properties up to the ordinance from the county and the city that says the tidal barrier needs to be at elevation 5 in AVD. And there are adjacent properties, some of which have seawalls at elevation 4, which is well above what the current king tide is, but not up to the current ordinance. And so the project here is, we've got some money from the state. Let's create a plan that puts us in line with the requirements of 2050 ordinance and projections of 2070 worst case scenario. Now, when the private residents go to do a major project on properties that maybe have a seawall at 4, which is amply high for the next 20 years, what I do was not say that we're pushing anything on any private landowners, but I also didn't want to show a map that says, when we finish our project in 2070, A1A will still be flooded. That's because that would assume that those folks did not end up raising their seawalls for the building department and the ordinances. So presumably over the next 45 years, those will come up as well. And so we show an example of what that'll look like.
or not, right? And then
So
it's like building a partial bridge.
right. So we can't go on someone else's property and build their seawall, but the ordinance is such that the language in the Broward County Model Code and in the City of Hollywood Code says that if there's tidal trespass, so if other people's properties are being flooded because your seawall's too low, then there is a place for the city to step in and enforce that rule, right? So that's not the place of the county Parks and Rec Department, but the way the ordinance is written, it would be such that that will become an issue. Now, honestly, at this point, none of the properties in the middle of have seawalls that are so low that they're an issue right now. There are seawalls north of north of Hawksbill, like commercial areas, they have low seawalls from what we can tell. And so it could be that in the next, 5 years or so, somebody could make a case that, hey, these guys need to raise their seawall. It's affecting A1A. I don't know. That's not really my purview.
So can I ask another one? So when you guys are done with your project, assuming nobody else does anything else, none of these private homes or whatever, is it gonna seal? Is it gonna prevent water from coming past that wall or
So we will prevent tidal water from coming over and into
that spot?
A1A. And we will prevent with a flap gate or a check valve of sorts, water from coming in in the pipe and out. The water from the north that might be coming in, we're not able to do anything about, but that's the ordinance would be hopefully bringing up those seawalls as you work your way north. In my, I have survey for our area, but if I drive north and I look, I'm like, man, some of these are really low. So I think there are places, and that's what some of our modeling showed, places from the north where there's moves.
So I guess what I'm asking is that when you do all this project and spend all this money on this, which I agree, I'm not, disagreeing to the project or to that, I know that there's a need for it. But when water is flooding the same spot that you built a wall on because it flowed from the north to the south or from the south to the north, what are you going to say to that? Or what are the people going to say? You spent all this money and it's still flooding and now it's trapped and it's,
I think
So is that not why isn't it done ahead of time so that when we seal it, we seal it? I mean, shouldn't.
Yeah, so I understand. And I think there's a couple things, right? So worst case, the county parks as the last act. And then all of the other folks are like, hey, we've been doing our part. Why isn't our county government that we pay taxes to doing theirs? So good story here is the county's trying to get ahead and be a first mover in this situation. I think, looking at it in that regard, to me, I had a number 2, but I think, resilience. Okay, if there's a slide here early that shows projected sea level rise to like 2,300 or whatever, right? So you have to pick a point in time that you're trying to reach. Sorry. There has to be a point in time that you pick, right? So, so over here, this goes up to, forever. I mean, it would continue going on, but so that's 2,100, right? So we picked sea level rise is an additional 2 feet basically in 2070 from 2.5 to 4.5, whatever it works out to. So resilience is like this. As people have started to think about what do we need to do with respect to sea level rise for infrastructure, that's the world I'm in engineering. It's like, let's do the best we can to make our things resilient and adaptable that we can go forward. In 40 years, when, Lord willing, I'm still alive, but probably not doing this, some other engineer might be coming behind and putting an actual wall into the top of that barrier to push you from 2070 to 2120. And so we have to pick a place that we're going to seal off to. And so we've picked 2070. The ordinances say you've got to be at 5 by 2050. But it's kind of hard to say nothing is a permanent fix. So I think that's why when you think about the way we would do it, Penny's smarter than me. She'll help answer.
The other reason the ordinance goes through the predicted elevation at 2070 is because we look at the design life of the structure. So we don't want to design to an elevation that the structure is going to need to be replaced before the water is ever to that elevation. So when we look at the ordinance, the way the ordinance is written, and this is the county ordinance and the city ordinance, water is always going to find the point of lowest elevation to come over. Once that water comes across property onto public right-of-way or adjacent private property, then that parcel gets sited. So we know that the water is coming across these low county-owned parcels with no tidal flood barriers. And so once that water comes across, then the county gets cited by either the city or they cite themselves. They know that they're in violation. The water is going to find the next lowest elevation. The way the ordinance is written is once you're cited or your wall's in disrepair, your tidal flood barrier, not necessarily a wall, or you're doing improvements that cost more than 50% of a new tidal flood barrier, you have to raise your tidal flood barrier. The way the ordinance is written is if it's before 2035, you can go to +4 NAVD as long as that structure is designed to be raised to +5 in the future. You're not going to have to raise it again to +5 until you're allowing tidal floodwater trespass, your structure's in disrepair, or you're doing repairs that cost more than 50% of a tidal flood barrier again. So eventually there's going to be a domino effect where everybody is going to get cited and everybody is going to have to raise their tidal flood barriers. But to design a structure to an elevation of higher than +5 or to require everybody to do it tomorrow, it's just not going to happen. And you don't want to design something to an elevation that's going to exceed the design life of the structure.
One last question, and then I'll shut up. So what about telling the property owners, listen, we need to do it, we need to seal it off. Either we do it or you do it, and like make it as part of the budget is that you guys do that. And it may not be as pretty as what they might do, or it may not be exactly what they wanted, but you leave it up to one or the other,
So Broward County and the Army Corps of Engineers did an extensive study to come up with the elevation of +5 NAVD and to design an ordinance that would serve as a model ordinance for all other tidally influenced municipalities within the county. And so they determined through extensive public meetings, this is going on 2.5 years ago, almost 3 years ago now, but through extensive public meetings, they determined with, I'm sure, a lot of legal input that the best way to implement the ordinance and to require the municipalities to implement the ordinance was the 3 triggers that were identified: tidal floodwater trespass, disrepair, or improvements that cost more than 50% of the cost of a new tidal flood barrier. So again, to go out and say everybody has to do it tomorrow isn't necessarily practicable, because some of these are in great around them has elevated their structure and they're now the low point. It's not necessary to force them to raise their structure.
And I'll just add in response to kind of a nuanced part of your question and also point out that I was right. Penny is smarter than I am, as you guys just saw. It's not part of this project to try to do those improvements outside of those properties, largely because we're focusing on a grant. So we have a grant from Resilient Florida that's through the state DEP to say, hey, we're a parks department. We're going to do improvements on parks for the resiliency. That piece, we're trying to stay very close to. The grant had this scope and we're staying within this scope. If we were going to say, we're going to also design seawall improvements to the adjacent commercial marine property, I don't think we'd be able to get reimbursement for some of our efforts in the same way. So we have to stay kind of in the scope of what is the grant money that we're getting from the state. If some other governing entity decided this was an important thing to do kind of in an imposed fashion, it would be outside of the purpose of the grant money that we have here, and that would be a different effort. That makes sense.
As a common citizen,
Yes.
to hear that it is maddening to me. It's like saying, well, we'll do what we, what our project is, but the water, 5 blocks down the street, the water's going to be pouring in, and that's county, we don't do that. And what you're trying to do is block the water. I don't care who does it, just do it, and don't leave gaps, because water's going to keep coming in and everybody's going to be complaining about it. And, so if the purpose is to block the water, then get together with everybody and let's do it all at the same time, not, whenever whoever thinks it's important, it's either important.
Right. I think there's like a term in environmental space, the tragedy of commons, where it takes multiple entities to really work together to solve a situation like this. And that's really what I'm trying to say when I'm saying we have this grant, this is our scope, is this shoreline is a common space that has municipal, county, private actors in it. And so the county is taking their piece of the puzzle and trying to move forward. And this common citizenry, the role, I guess, is to try to push either other government actors or private actors to move with the county. And so it's not really the place of the county to, people don't like the government knocking on your front door and saying, we're here to help, we're the government. And so we're trying to set the example rather than do the enforcement, but maybe there's a place for the enforcement.
Well, hello, everybody. I'm Eugene Bold. Should I stand? I feel like I'm towering over everybody. I'm Eugene Bold, and I'm a neighbor. For the past almost 15 years, I've been driving through those floods, and so I'm intimately familiar with them. I also had the privilege of for the county for about 5.5 years with Commissioner Ryan. So I'm quite familiar with, the language and some of these, the language that you posted. And I appreciate you explaining some of the intricacies of that language because I think there's a responsibility that falls on the elected official. And like you were saying, there are so many pieces of the puzzle, and I think we have to start demanding more accountability from our elected officials. At the port, we have a project that was started in supposed to basically reimagine what our port can and should be. And because of U.S. fisheries and a web of and a patchwork of inadequate political efforts, the project is still ongoing. Millions have been spent from design to engineering, all sorts of millions have been spent, our money, and it's still not approved. And that to me was an example of why we need to demand more as a community, why we need to push more for more accountability, and why these kind of projects have to be thought of in conjunction with DOT, with our federal partners. The groundwork and the foundation of a lot of these projects has to be done now in terms of approaching all of the stakeholders in these types of projects, as opposed to, well, this is my piece, and you said, well, that's where the property line ends. I'm sorry, we cannot go any further than that. So I think this takes a lot of work, but I appreciate you being here. And Mr. Dan West is absolutely amazing. I've worked with him for the past 5.5 years, and he's, probably the best we have at the county. But this way beyond and above, Parks and Rec. This is really a national problem. But I think we have to start demanding more accountability. That's where it all begins. And then all of these other pieces can be brought together in agencies. But those are my comments because I've seen the lack of progress on so many projects that should have been already done. So thank you for being here and thank you for what you do.
So my company has offices in various parts of Florida, and we have some folks in Tampa that I think it was the city of Clearwater came to us and asked us to meet with them and explain the Broward County model ordinance language and how they could try to implement things like that in their area, because they have the same exact problem, but they don't even have the kind of government structure and the ordinances to start moving forward on all the pieces of the puzzle. So I think you're right. This is something that there is a big role for leadership in our municipal government. And what you see in these ordinances is motion forward more than you see in other places in Florida. more of an opinion than an answer, but anyway.
I'm just wondering, as you're talking, if you're going to put seawalls in along A1A, would private property owners be able to piggyback off the price they get if they wanted to put their own seawalls in to get discounted rate that you're probably going to negotiate?
So the types of bulkheads that we're doing are like a rock riprap. And my guess is that not everyone would want that style because they want like a boat dock or something like that. This isn't quite as amenable to that. I don't know, the rules of, procurement and things can be an issue. I have been on projects before where I've seen the adjacent private landowner talking to the contractor out on the site and saying, hey, while you're out here. And certainly myself as the engineer on those projects, I'm like, great. If you're making friends with the neighbor, everybody's walking away happy. I'm a big fan. So I would imagine the type of contractor we're going to get is somebody that's pretty well equipped because this is a pretty large coastal project. And so maybe there will be those kinds of opportunities, but it wouldn't be something that we would formalize, I think, in any contract language. Yeah, for sure. For sure. I think it's a great idea. It's a great idea. Okay. I mean, certainly we can talk about it. Martin is a whiz with contracting and contractors and things. No, that's not Martin. I'm just kidding. That's Martin, but you may not want public speaking is not his thing. Any other questions or comments? Oh, okay.
Bob Hogg, my hearing's not so great, so maybe it's been discussed, but has there been any thoughts about raising the roads up so that they're higher because inevitably a massive rain event or whatever's going to get water trapped in there somehow? It'd be nice to keep the roads passable. I mean, these other things are great. We need to do that. And then the second question, at what point in your tidal assumptions, if they come out to be true, does the flooding from the ocean side overwhelm the worries of the flooding from the intercoastal side?
Yeah, I think to take the second question first, I think the topography is such that like sand, the kind of dune formation is such that that's not going to be an issue in the first 50-year push, water from the ocean side. As far as the road is concerned, I don't know if staff from DOT wants to comment, but usually I've looked at some of these types of projects, and road raising is pretty expensive for a couple different reasons, and one of which is, for one, just the amount of fill and bringing everything up. But two, one of the tricky parts is harmonizing. So you got to come to every adjacent intersection, road, and driveway and such, and make that transition. And in a lot of cases, you've got the swale along the side of the road where you're capturing the runoff. If you raise the road and you bring that swale up, now you've got this edge. You can't have like a retaining wall. The grading transition from this new higher road into the adjacent private property is always the tricky part. It is something that you're starting to see. Our company did one in Miami Beach. I think it was like 8 inches or something. So it wasn't a dramatic change, but it was when we built a pump station. We did a lot of different things, flap gates, but at the end of not the switch to flip with the available tax dollars. So DOT is very proactive with kind of surveilling and assessing the conditions of things. I mean, they obviously identified this as an area of concern, building the seawall, building the pump stations. So, I think as we were saying before, and as Penny mentioned, you're trying to build for the lifespan. If you know that this road with the proper fixes can be dry for another 30 years, that's the lifespan of the road. So you're going to have to rebuild some segment of that road or at least do a major resurfacing in that period. When you decide to raise is kind of, you're going to reassess that every cycle of maintenance. But it's a good point. I think you're going to see more road raising in the future.
Just a comment, which is, first of all, thank you to Brett for being so cutting edge with the will be emulated around the state. But also, I think people don't realize how complicated the land ownership is in this area. You have the county parks, you have the state controls A1A, and then the city controls the side streets, and the city controls the enforcing building codes and ordinances on the private property. So you have all these players. And I think recently FDOT, the county and the city have really come together to try to tackle some of these very difficult flooding and resiliency issues that I think have come upon us a little bit faster than maybe FDOT thought about 10 years ago. So there's been a real change in the collaboration between all of these agencies, and down in the Central Beach area, which is the CRA, that's a fourth agency that's been involved. So again, just a gratitude for this collaborative effort in trying to tackle some of these really challenging problems. I think the county's been a great partner, and, you know, I think the goal for all of us should be to maximize these grant dollars.
Yes.
'Cause these are expensive projects, and in the world of expediting things and making sure that we don't lose grants and things like that, I know the city of Hollywood is here to do whatever it can.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.
I think we got through all the questions, so I really appreciate all your time. I have some business cards back there if you want to send me comments or questions. And also, Mr. West, did you want to make a comment?
Just a couple of comments. One, wanted to make sure that everyone knows that Mayor Furr couldn't make it tonight, but is very, very committed to this project. As you can tell, in the past, he's been very on, and I know our commission is very committed. I thank the city of Hollywood. This is something that it's going to take a lot of work, but we're the first step. The grant that we received is going to be a very important grant, and it is on our county lands, but very important that everyone notes that our commitment is obvious. We've been committed to this project as well as many others along this intercoastal and at Westlake and Hollywood North Beach. And I also want to thank FDOT for showing up part of this project as well. And I think I've covered most of the other things. If you have questions, obviously tonight, as well as at other times, and I'm certainly sure that they're going to have all this posted on the website. So you can go back and look at the PowerPoint, as I understand. Is that correct? And then all that information will be gathered, and we'll keep everyone posted on where we're going with this. This is a creative effort. And as you can see by just some of the work that's being done, we're going to do something better than what we had before. This also got some environmental purposes and some enhancement for the shoreline, flooding purposes, mitigation, but also I think it'll be a great project for many, many years to come, along with many other things we're doing. So thank you. And you can tell we've hired some really good designers. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.